Hello, Connecting Point. It's good to be back with you. And we're going to be picking up our journey through David's life story. And I was thinking last week, we spent a lot of time looking at these very cynical power grabbers, Joab and Abner. But I was quite moved thinking about how even though we have these morally questionable actions of these kingmakers, what we see happening is that God's will and work continues to push forward, kind of in spite of the less than pure motives, let's say, of these characters, Joab and Abner. And this week we're going to be continuing down this path and looking at the theme of God's work pushing on in spite of what's going on in the context, the cultural context of David's life. David is going to be continuing to navigate his way through this transferal of power from Saul's family to his own. So my day job is to teach the humanities, which is English and social studies, and I teach this to high school students. And one of my consistent refrains to my students is that all of the social studies and all of the literature that we study are to some extent descriptions of human efforts at sin management. It's a bit of a cynical description, but I think this is actually really true. Any literature that you read is going to be built around a conflict, right? All novels have a conflict. It's one of the silly exercises I make my students do, is to identify the main conflict in the novel. But all of these conflicts have sin as you want to talk about root cause. That's the real root cause of these problems, these conflicts that arise in literature. And history is nothing more than the mostly miserable record of how well, or usually poorly, humankind has done at managing the effects of sin in the world around them. I teach this subject not because I'm hopeless about humankind and because I see this as a essentially fruitless pursuit, but because I think of myself as a realist. And the Bible gives us this realist perspective on humankind as well. We have a very realistic impression of what humankind is like as we look at the cynical power grabbing of kingmakers like Joab and Abner. I've never heard of any politician act cynically and for their own interest, right? So it doesn't pull punches. The Bible doesn't pull punches about the evil in the universe, the evil within us, and yet it gives us hope because it lets us know and lets us see that evil is not the only thing that's at work. And that's a key principle as you're reading through the Bible, is that, and we talked about it before, I've talked about this from the pulpit before, that when you read the Bible, we only really have one protagonist, right? That would be God himself, and especially through Jesus, right? And everyone else is stuck in this. There's no real antagonist aside from Satan, but you have these agonists, right? They're people who are agonizing through life. They're struggling, they're suffering, right? And they're dealing with the effects of the poor choices that they make. And to a lesser or greater extent, they're succeeding, right? A lot of the time, we get to see David as a real protagonist in his story. But it's not exclusively that, right? We're going to see David completely fail at a variety of points. And where we get hope is because as he struggles, he continues to reach for goodness and righteousness, and we're going to come back and explore that a little bit today. That's one of the things I love about the Bible, is that it shows us that yes, we are fallen, but it also shows us that we do have some capacity to manage sin on a personal level, and ultimately to manage sin out of our lives through repentance and forgiveness, and so that the effects of sin, the ultimate effect of sin, isn't God's wrath isn't visited upon us. We still end up dealing with the consequences here on a day-to-day level, but we do have this ultimate hope about what our sin is. And even at a social level, I think the Bible gives us hope to think about societies that do seek God's will, to seek His kingdom and righteousness, and the way that those do effectively manage sin on some level. Right? Paul describes this as a legitimate role of government in the book of Romans. However, in our fallenness, we often don't think about the knock-on effects of our efforts at sin management. And I think there's a number of ways you can brainstorm about this. Here's an example from economic history, right? In the energy sector, we moved in the transition from the 19th to 20th centuries from using literal horsepower, where you have just dozens and dozens and dozens of horses in any sort of dense cluster of people's cities, right? And you'd have a ton of environmental problems based on the fact that there's all this horse manure around, right? Air quality is very poor, dust on these unpaved roads. The quality of air, the quality of life in these cities is poor. Now we make this invention, the combustion engine, which radically transforms the economy, and every one of us is able to have much more power available to ourselves. But we didn't know about the knock-on effect of that. We would start burning these fossil fuels, and that there would become environmental smog and other problems like that have solving one problem creates a new set of problems, is kind of what I'm getting at. So I want you to take a minute to think about this and have a table talk about the efforts of sin management. And you could think of an example from your own life where you solve one sin problem, but then you realize you've got this other problem that comes about. Or you could think about it in terms of like a more macro level, a social level, economic, political, war. Think about social programs, something like that. Do our efforts at sin management ever solve problems? All right, take a couple minutes to think about that. Lately, I've been reading T.H. White's rendering of the Arthurian legend, right? King Arthur and the Round Table, and it's called The Once and Future King, and it's an excellent, it's a set of novellas, actually, is sort of what it is. But the first portion of the book is concerned with Arthur's education. He gets turned into a variety of animals to learn things about the way that the world works, and Merlin does this, so as to achieve all of this, and Merlin's seeking to imprint in Arthur some specific lessons to help him to become a good ruler, because he knows Arthur's fate, even though Arthur doesn't himself know that he's destined to become the King of England. So after Arthur successfully pulls the sword from the stone and ascends to the throne of England, right? One of his first royal responsibilities is to put down something like a rebellion from some of the non-English parts of his nobility. But the problem that Arthur is running into is that the way that things have been, the mighty, the knights, these lords who've gone pouncing around in their armor, have been abusive of the weak. And this was a problem in medieval society, right? And it's a reason why kings become the answer. So the previous King Uther, Arthur's father, was very much guilty of this bullying mentality, the powerful bullying the weak. And Merlin points this out to Arthur, that might had been right. But Arthur kind of slowly but surely arrives at this conclusion that might shouldn't be right, that right should govern might. However, in fighting these morally questionable knights, Arthur is realizing, and Sir Kay, one of his kind of inner circle, point out to Arthur that his method of beating down the people who think might is right is just kind of doing the same thing, isn't it? Like, you still have to impose a morality on this broken people. And isn't that what the problem is? Even if your solution is actually a better thing than what the problem is. And I think this is an interesting story. It's kind of the anglicized version. Arthur is very much following in the lineage of David in many ways. He's a man who's striving to provide an ideal for kingship, right? That's what the legend of Arthur is all about. And David, in some ways, he's a true myth in some ways, right? That there's a lot of myth around David, a mystique, maybe you want to say, instead of myth. But that David is a true story that's getting at this myth. So I'm starting here in our text today because I want us to kind of think about this. I don't know. It's been important to me lately to be thinking about how, as our society changes and as our technology grows, you hear lots of people talking about how it's unprecedented times and all this stuff. I don't see it that way. I see the fundamental problem with humankind is the same as it's always been. The modes of how we do that change, the mediums, but the fundamental problems are still the same, right? The powerful abuse the weak, and we need to learn how to govern ourselves, and we need to learn how to work with each other. And these are all questions that come up through the stories of David, or then through other like object lessons like the stories of King Arthur. But anyhow, we're going to take our text today, which is 2 Samuel 4, and we're going to just kind of slide into chapter 5 a little bit. When Ish-Boseth, son of Saul, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost courage, and all Israel became alarmed. Now Saul's son had 2 men who were leaders of raiding bands. One of them was named Banah, and the other Rechab, and they were sons of Rimmon the Beerothite from the tribe of Benjamin. Beeroth is considered part of Benjamin because the people of Beeroth fled to Gittaim and have resided there as foreigners to this day. Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled. His name was Mephibosheth. Now Rechab and Banah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, set out for the house of Ish-Boseth, and they arrived there in the heat of the day while he was taking his noonday rest. They went into the inner part of the house as if to get some wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. And then Rechab and his brother Banah slipped away. They'd gone into the house while he was lying on the bed in his bedroom. After they stabbed and killed him, they cut off his head, taking it with them. They traveled all night by way of the Arabah. They brought the head of Ish-Boseth to David at Hebron and said to the king, "Here's the head of Ish-Boseth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to kill you. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring." David answered Rechab and his brother Banah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, "As surely as the Lord lives, who's delivered me out of every trouble, when someone told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. That was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house, and on his own bed should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you?" And so David gave an order to his men, and they killed him. They killed them. They cut off their hands and feet and hung the bodies by the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ish-Boseth and buried it in Abner's tomb at Hebron. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. So there are 3 main points that I want to explore as we think about this story. And the first one is that there is a lot of paralleling, as you may have noticed, from this chapter between Saul's death and Abner's death at the hands of Joab and Abishai that we talked about last week, and then Ish-Boseth's death at the hands of Rechab and Banah. In both cases, we're seeing a member of Saul's family killed, right? Abner had been the real power broker in the Saulite kind of house after Saul's death, as he was the military commander, kind of the senior family member, and he was seemingly quite well respected by both his own forces, the Israelite forces, and then by the Judahites that were led by David and Joab. David recognizes in chapter 3 Abner's place as one of the great men of Israel, and that David is happy to co-opt him and bring him onto his side to truly make his rule a rule of both the north and the south. David had, by the time of chapter 3, he'd really consolidated his hold in Judah, but Abner, he saw, was helpful in bringing Israel into the fold, the northern tribes. Of course, what we saw happen was that Abner was killed by those sons of Zeruiah, and with Abner gone, Ish-Boseth is the last barrier that really remains between David, that's posed by Saul's family, between David and full kingship of all of Israel. we see in verse 4 of our text today that there is still this lame son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth, but being lame, he's unfit to rule, right? He can't go out and lead the army. He won't have he's young as well, right? They talk about how young he is. He won't have the ability to go and kind of be the front man for the band, as it were. And we learned last week as well that Saul's family had actually been brought back into David's family, as David has been reunited with his estranged wife Michal through Abner's actions, right? This moment here of Ish-Boseth's death really kind of paves the way smoothly, smooths the path, as it were, for David to become the king over all of Israel. However, we notice also that there is this repetition of David's wrath upon these graspers, right? These good news bearers, or at least they think they're bringing David good news. David had already visited wrath upon the Amalekite who brought the news of Saul's death to him back in 2 Samuel chapter 1. And now Baanah and Rechab experienced this same justice. So I guess it's worth considering for a moment why these guys experience David's wrath, but Joab doesn't after he murders Abner. And so there are a couple of kind of logical reasons. First of all, I think you're seeing that Joab is David's kinsman, right? His nephew. And so it's going to be a bit of a harder sell to kill your own nephew, even if he's a lawbreaker. Joab is also very good at his job, right? He's a very he's a kingmaker himself, right? With the level of violence that he's willing to get to, and his obvious command and sway over the army, right? Thirdly, Abner isn't a king. He's a kingmaker, but he's not a king. And so I guess in a hierarchical society, the crime is also a lesser crime. And then lastly, the people are satisfied with David's rebuke of Joab, right? That David pronounces such harsh words upon Joab back in chapter 3. It is interesting to read the different commentators to see how some of them, I don't know, I guess it depends a lot on how they perceive David, right? Some see him as a very political animal, and some see him as really religiously or morally motivated. Both Abner and Ish-Boseth represent this very large power block that could push Israel into civil war. Abner was obviously the more capable of the two, but Ish-Boseth is clearly more symbolically important of the two. And it is extremely convenient for David that both Abner and Ish-Boseth are killed and that he is seen as innocent of their blood. This allows David to act as a unifying figure that brings together all these tribal factions that have cause, even generational cause, if you think back into the book of the Judges, to continue to war with each other rather than turning their attention onto their external enemies. And David is going to be continuing to pursue this middle path of being for Judah, but also of being for all of Israel, right? And being symbolic as the king of the whole nation, not just of his tribe. And to this end, you see David treat Abner, Saul, and Ish-Boseth with honor, right? That befits the great men, right? As if they're his own family, his own kinsmen, right? And he mourns for them. He publicly makes a big display of it, right? He publicly makes a big display of, like, this is what happens when you kill a king. To Rechab and Baanah, he draws and quarters them essentially, and puts them out on display for everybody to see. This is what happens to you when you come after the king. Both, a personal defense choice, but also I think one of those things that really publicly states, no, this is not the way that we're going to behave as a nation. And that's a large part of what David's legitimacy is about, is he provides for Israel a higher way of thinking about kingship. And that's what I want to explore as the third and final point, and we'll take most of the rest of our time on it. David is, all of this kind of groundwork that we're seeing is to set up David's legitimacy as the king of Israel, not just as the king of Judah. The people of all the tribes in chapter 5 now recognize that Saul's line had failed, right? And that Saul himself was obsessed with trying to kill his greatest general for years. And that David had in fact been the one fighting Israel's battles, right? He had picked up the mantle that Saul had let fall from himself in his kind of psychosis towards the end of his life, and that David was the true defender of the people against the Philistines. David had carried out all this successful raiding, right? His men, ragtag bunch that they were molded into this great fighting force in this early Iron Age time period. So we get this note that there's this public ceremony that takes place in Hebron, which, as we saw in previous weeks, was a Judahite city, but it was also a Levite city. And so both David's tribal foundation as a Judahite, but also the religious legitimacy of having the Levites on board with the coronation are shown in this ceremony. And we also get this new note that David isn't just going to stick in his tribal power center, right? Hebron isn't going to become the permanent capital, but in fact, he's going to be taking a new capital for himself, which we're going to learn about more next week. And then we get this kind of summary statement at the end about a 40-year reign and these 7 years, 6 months that David rules from Hebron in Judah. And so the 40-year note is interesting. 40 always represents completeness in the Bible, so it might well just be a symbolic number, but there's a specificity in that 7-year, 6-month gap that they describe, that the commentators really like to describe how historically rooted all of these stories are. And in some ways, I kind of think that the key point that we see in chapter 5 is that David is called by the different tribal elders a shepherd for the nation. And that provides, I think it provides a really clear counter argument to the suggestion that David is merely acting politically in his rebuke of Joab and then in his execution of Rechab and Baanah, but that David is actually acting in this shepherd-like way for the people of Israel. Now, before we take some time to finish up exploring this idea, I want you to take a moment in a table talk to think about why the metaphor of shepherd would be used in this context. Go ahead. Shepherd is an interesting choice to be the metaphor for the king, because it does provide a clear power discrepancy between the people and the ruler, right? A shepherd is a human, obviously, and a sheep are not. So you have this clear differentiation between who's able to make decisions and to think things through and whatnot. But shepherd is also significant because of the mutuality of the relationship that a shepherd has to his sheep, right? The shepherd's livelihood, right, his financial success, depends upon him keeping his sheep healthy, reproducing, right? That their wool be good and that their bodies be fat, right? This is all the things that the shepherd wants to do, right? He needs to protect and provide for his sheep. And in return, the sheep give him his sustenance, right? He's able to live because his sheep are performing well, right? And so it's an interesting way to think about the mutuality of the relationship between someone with responsibility and someone to whom that person or for whom that person is responsible. So the shepherd is, of course, linked in with some of the most these famous sections of Scripture, right? The most famous of the Psalms. Psalm 23, where David describes God as being his shepherd, right? David isn't just a shepherd for his people, but he understands that there's this relationship that God is my shepherd, and because I can follow God's ways, I can act that way for my people. Now, in Psalm 23, mostly what David is doing is expressing his trust in God through all of life's hardships, and he does this in a beautiful way. Ezekiel picks up the shepherd metaphor in chapter 34 of his prophetic work, and he describes the failure of the elites of Israel to take their responsibility as shepherds for the people seriously, and they emphasize their own gain instead of that mutuality of having obligation to the people, to be providing security and a place for them to be well clothed and to be fattened, right, as it were. Ezekiel goes on to describe that God is ultimately going to step in as all of humankind's shepherd and to sort out the sheep from the goats, right? We have this interesting metaphor that Ezekiel really chases out. And as he does that, but Jesus actually also chases out that same metaphor, describing himself in those Ezekiel-like terms. In John chapter 10, right? Jesus calling himself the Good Shepherd. And one of the ways that we understand the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel is that we see that they're an attempt to address the sin management problem that is presented by the book of Judges. Recall that the final verdict at the end of the book of Judges was that Israel had given in to an anarchic moral subjectivity. Everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. And so the institution of kingship is to provide a focal point for the political, judicial, and military energies of this people and provide more unity. And the role of the king is supposed to be this shepherding role, this caring, careful, defensive position for the people. And Samuel's rebuke to the people, if you'll recall way back into our 1st Samuel study, was that the monarchy centralizes things and that this is dangerous because it gives one person the power to start to make decisions about how things are going to go. And if one is not capable or willing to govern oneself, one invites then a king to come in and govern themselves, and to govern everybody else. And that is only ever going to be as good as the individual who steps into that kingly role. And we saw that it was a failure under Saul, right? Israel's foreign policy became a mess. The Philistines were able to run roughshod over the people. And what we're going to see it happen with David, that because David is a better king, because he is a man who takes seriously this idea of shepherding, that Israel is going to have success. And what we will see right now is that David is shown in this light as being a shepherd, as being a good king. He's not going to always do that, but for the most part he will. So as a point of reminder, I want us to take a quick look back at Deuteronomy chapter 17 to see what the king is supposed to be like. This is Deuteronomy 17 verses 14 through 20. And of course, this is Moses' instructions to the people of Israel about how the kings are going to operate, or how they're supposed to operate when they get into the land. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it, and settled in it, and you say, "Let us set a king over us, like all the nations around us," be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who's not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he's to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It's to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. And then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. In this description, we can see Israel and David's success through the stories that we've been reading over the last few weeks. We see that David takes seriously the notion of justice. We can see that David takes seriously his responsibility, at least at this point, to the people, and that they recognize that David has been their protector. We can also see the seeds of his failure that will come about as the story unfolds, David already having accumulated at least 3 wives. For now, though, David's reverence for Saul and Ish-Boseth and his engagement with Abner to bring the north on board, and then his rebuke of Joab for his murderous ways show that David is taking seriously verses 19 and 20 from that Deuteronomical instruction about how to be the king. Okay, I want to send you to a final table talk to wrap up the week this week, but I want to introduce one more idea to throw into the kind of the blender for you to think about as you think about my final question. And that is that we don't live in a society that takes very seriously the power of kings and strong men and people to be in charge of us so that we can all follow him anymore. We're a pretty democratic individualistic people at this point. And it is kind of befitting of, in some ways, the instructions that were given by the apostles after Jesus ascends to heaven. In 1 Peter, Peter describes regenerated humankind with the love of Christ in their life, with the power of the Holy Spirit in their life now, as a royal priesthood, right? With the responsibilities of kings and of priests in us, right? That's what the body of Christ is not a collection of sheep following a pastor, although it does have that element at times. But it is a brotherhood and sisterhood of royal priests. And that, I think, is a really significant idea, right? That through the Holy Spirit, we don't have to be beholden to strongmen anymore, but we can actually get into this idea of self-government, right? That we can embrace that part of what all this is, right? We read about these heroes in the Old Testament, but we're not supposed to necessarily think of them as like the high and mighty, right? But as examples to think about in our own lives, right? David is an example for you and I of someone who struggles with God, and not always a good example, right? But someone who you read about him and you take lessons from, you think through what his life means. So I want you to take some time to think through what David's life means, right? Here's your table talk question. Does the metaphor of the shepherd, the Deuteronomic description of the king, Peter's description of us as a royal priesthood, does this strike you as odd in a world as broken as ours is? All right. And talk that over, mull that over. Take some time to pray with each other, to think about where you need to do some self-governance, or where you have some battles that need to be fought. And pray over those things with the people with you. And be blessed this week, and we'll see you next time.